The first thing I saw that morning wasn't the courthouse. It was my mother's face. 20 years had passed since she slammed the front door behind me while I stood in the freezing rain, clutching my newborn daughter with nowhere to go. Now she was standing just outside Courtroom 7, wearing an expensive cream-colored suit, pretending she belonged there. When her eyes met mine, she didn't recognize me. Why would she? The frightened 16-year-old girl she had abandoned was gone. In her place stood a woman, in a tailored navy suit carrying a leather case filled with evidence instead of fear. My stepfather folded his arms and smirked. He still believed this lawsuit would end the same way my childhood had, with me losing everything. Their attorney was speaking confidently, flipping through a stack of documents. Then he looked up. His eyes landed on me. The color drained from his face. His hand froze halfway through turning a page. For several long seconds, he simply stared. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he said, "Good morning, prosecutor." The hallway fell silent. My mother frowned. "What did you just call her?" The lawyer swallowed hard. He looked at my parents as if they had walked into a disaster they couldn't possibly understand. "You didn't tell me." "She's a senior prosecutor." My stepfather's confident smile disappeared instantly, for the first time in 20 years. I watched fear replace pride in his eyes. They thought they were coming to take everything from me. They had no idea they were about to lose far more than a lawsuit. Because 20 years earlier, they had thrown a homeless 16-year-old mother onto the street with a newborn baby. And today, that same girl was about to destroy every lie they had built their lives on. It all began on the coldest night of my life. The night my life changed forever began with a knock on the front door. I was 16 years old. Until that evening, my biggest worries were passing chemistry, finishing my history project, and saving enough money from my weekend job at a small grocery store to buy my first used car. Motherhood wasn't even something I knew how to imagine, but life doesn't ask whether you're ready. It simply changes everything. I opened the front door and saw my boyfriend, Tyler. His face was pale. His eyes were swollen from crying. He wasn't alone. In his trembling arms was a tiny baby wrapped in a faded pink hospital blanket. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he carefully placed the baby into my arms. "Her name is Lily," he whispered. My heart stopped. Before I could ask a single question, he lowered his head. "My parents are sending me away tonight. I can't take her with me. I don't even know if I'll ever come back." Tears streamed down his face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." A black SUV pulled into the driveway. Someone inside honked the horn. Tyler kissed Lily's forehead one last time. Then he looked at me. "Please, don't let her grow up believing we didn't love her." Those were the last words I ever heard from him. He climbed into the SUV. The taillights disappeared into the darkness. I stood frozen on the porch, 16 years old, holding a newborn baby girl, completely alone. I slowly walked into the living room. My mother looked up from her coffee. My stepfather muted the television. The room became painfully quiet. "I need your help," I whispered. Neither of them moved. Neither of them looked at Lily. Instead, my stepfather stood. His expression was cold. "So it's true," he said. "You actually ruined your life." I tried explaining everything, that Tyler had been forced to leave, that the baby had nowhere else to go, that I didn't know what to do. I wasn't asking them to raise her. I was only asking for time, for one chance, for help. My mother looked at me for a long moment. Then she quietly stood up, walked past me, and disappeared into my bedroom. A minute later, she returned carrying one old suitcase. She dropped it beside the front door. My stomach tightened. "What are you doing?" She wouldn't answer. Instead, my stepfather walked toward me, pointed at the door, and said the words that would echo inside my mind for the next 20 years. "If you keep that baby, you don't live here anymore." I looked down at little Lily sleeping peacefully against my chest. She had no idea her future was being decided in that moment. Neither did I. But one thing became crystal clear. If I had to choose, between my family and my daughter. I already knew my answer. I picked up the suitcase, wrapped the blanket tighter around Lily, opened the front door, and stepped into the freezing rain. With nowhere left to call home, the rain grew heavier with every step. Within 20 minutes, my sneakers were completely soaked. Cold water seeped through my jeans, and my arms ached from holding Lily close to my chest. She was only a few days old. Every time the icy wind blew across the empty streets, I instinctively wrapped my body around her, trying to shield her from the cold. I didn't care if I got sick. I just couldn't let anything happen to her. My phone battery had already died. I had exactly $32 in my pocket. No car, no job that could support a baby, no friends I could call at midnight. Every house I passed had warm lights glowing behind the windows. Families were eating dinner, watching television, laughing together. Meanwhile, I was walking through the storm with my entire future sleeping in my arms. For the first time that night, I started to cry. Not because I had been thrown out, but because I genuinely didn't know where Lily and I would sleep before sunrise. Then I remembered someone, Mrs. Helen Brooks. She had been my English teacher during freshman year. Everyone at school called her strict. I called her kind. She was the only teacher who ever noticed when I skipped lunch because I couldn't afford food. She never embarrassed me. She simply placed an extra sandwich on my desk and pretended it was left over from the teacher's lounge. I hadn't spoken to her in months. I didn't even know if she still lived in the same place, but she was the only person I could think of. So I walked, another 40 minutes. By the time I reached her small white house on Maple Street, my legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. The porch light was off. The neighborhood was silent. I stared at the wooden front door for several seconds. What if she refused? What if she called the police? What if I had just walked all this way for nothing? Taking a deep breath, I knocked. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. Just as I turned to leave, the porch light flickered on. The front door slowly opened. Mrs. Helen stood there, wearing an old blue cardigan and reading glasses. She looked at my soaked clothes, then at the tiny baby wrapped against my chest, then at the suitcase sitting beside my feet. She didn't ask a single question. She didn't lecture me. She didn't look disappointed. Instead, she stepped aside, opened the door wider, and spoke 7 words that changed my life forever. "Come inside, sweetheart. You're safe now." The warmth of the house hit my face instantly. It smelled like cinnamon tea and fresh bread. For the first time since leaving home, I wasn't shivering anymore. Mrs. Helen disappeared into another room and returned carrying 2 thick towels. She gently wrapped one around my shoulders. Then she smiled at Lily. My goodness, she's absolutely beautiful. Those simple words broke me. They were the first kind words anyone had spoken to us that entire night. I burst into tears, real tears, the kind you can't stop. Mrs. Helen placed one hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to explain anything tonight. Right now, you both need warmth, food, and sleep." That night, for the second time in my life, someone opened a door for me. The difference was, one door had thrown me into the storm. The other saved my daughter's future. The next morning, I woke up convinced the night before had been a dream. But then I heard Lily crying. I opened my eyes and found myself lying on a small bed in Mrs. Helen's guest room. For the first time in almost 24 hours, we were warm, safe, alive. I walked into the kitchen carrying Lily in my arms. Mrs. Helen was already making breakfast. She smiled as if having 2 unexpected guests in her home was the most normal thing in the world. "I made oatmeal," she said, "and don't tell me you're not hungry." I hadn't realized how empty my stomach was until I smelled the food. As I sat down, she placed an envelope on the table. Inside was $500. I stared at it in disbelief. "I can't take this," I whispered. Mrs. Helen gently pushed the envelope back toward me. "This isn't charity. It's an investment. One day, when you're standing on your own feet, you'll help someone else." I nodded through my tears. That promise stayed with me for the next 20 years. The following weeks were the hardest of my life. I officially dropped out of high school, not because I wanted to, because I had no choice. Lily needed diapers, formula, medicine. I needed money. Every morning before sunrise, I left Mrs. Helen's house and searched for work. Most employers looked at me, saw a 16-year-old girl carrying a baby, and politely turned me away. Some weren't polite at all. One restaurant manager laughed. "We're looking for employees, not children playing house." His words stung, but I refused to cry. Every rejection made me more determined. Finally, a small neighborhood bakery gave me a chance. The owner, Mr. Alvarez, didn't ask about my past. He simply asked one question. "Can you work hard?" I answered. "I'll work harder than anyone you've ever hired." He smiled. "Be here tomorrow at 5. That job saved us. The work was exhausting. I cleaned tables, washed baking trays, mopped floors, loaded heavy bags of flour. Sometimes my hands cracked and bled from washing dishes in hot water all day. But every Friday, when I held my paycheck, I smiled, because every dollar meant Lily would have food. Mrs. Helen became the heart of our little family. While I worked, she cared for Lily as if she were her own granddaughter. Every evening, I came home completely exhausted. Without fail, dinner was waiting. Fresh soup, warm bread, a clean house, and Lily laughing the moment she saw me walk through the door. Those moments reminded me exactly why I refused to give up. Months turned into years. I earned my GED, then enrolled in community college. I studied after work while Lily slept beside me in a second-hand crib. Many nights, I fell asleep with textbooks spread across the kitchen table. Every single time. I woke up covered with a warm blanket. Mrs. Helen never said a word. She simply made sure I never fought alone. One rainy evening, while I was surrounded by law books and legal notes, she placed a cup of tea beside me. She looked at me with quiet confidence and said, "Emma, people think success comes from talent. They're wrong. It comes from refusing to quit." I looked at Lily sleeping peacefully on the couch, then back at the mountain of books waiting for me. In that moment, I made a promise, no matter how long it took, no matter how many years I had to struggle. One day, the homeless teenage mother everyone had abandoned would walk into a courtroom, not as a victim, but as the woman seeking justice. The years passed faster than I ever imagined. Lily wasn't the tiny baby I had once carried through a freezing rainstorm anymore. She was now a confident, intelligent 17-year-old who filled our little house with laughter instead of tears. Every achievement she earned felt like a victory we had fought for together. When she received an academic scholarship for college, she ran into the kitchen waving the acceptance letter above her head. "We did it, Mom." She hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "No," I whispered with tears in my eyes. "You did it." But deep inside, I knew we both had. A few months later, another envelope arrived in the mail. This one had the seal of the State Bar Association. For several minutes, I couldn't bring myself to open it. My hands were trembling. Mrs. Helen sat quietly across the table with her cup of tea. She smiled. "What are you waiting for?" I slowly opened the envelope. The first sentence blurred through my tears. "Congratulations. You have successfully passed the State Bar examination." I covered my mouth. I couldn't speak. 20 years earlier, people had looked at me and seen a homeless teenage mother with no future. Now, I was officially an attorney. Mrs. Helen stood up, wrapped her arms around me, and whispered, "I told you success belongs to those who refuse to quit." After earning my law license, I joined the district attorney's office as an assistant prosecutor. The first few months were overwhelming. Every case carried someone's future. Every decision mattered. I worked longer hours than anyone else, while other attorneys left the office at 5 o'clock. I stayed until midnight reviewing evidence, studying witness statements, preparing every question before stepping into a courtroom. People began noticing, not because I was loud, but because I was always prepared. One senior prosecutor joked, If Emma is handling the case, the defense should start negotiating. I smiled, but I never forgot where I'd come from. Every time I walked through the courthouse doors, I remembered the 16-year-old girl who once believed her life was over. That memory kept me humble. It also made me fearless, because after surviving homelessness with a newborn baby, no courtroom could ever intimidate me. Years turned into more years. My conviction record continued to grow. Eventually, I was promoted to Senior Prosecutor. The same courthouse that once would have terrified me had become my second home. Judges respected my preparation. Police detectives trusted my judgment. Even experienced defense attorneys knew they couldn't underestimate me. My name carried weight, not because of power, but because I never forgot why I became a prosecutor in the first place. I wasn't fighting for titles. I was fighting for people who had once felt as powerless as I had. Life finally felt peaceful. Lily had started college. Mrs. Helen enjoyed tending to her small garden every morning, for the first time in 20 years. It seemed as though the storm was finally behind us. Then one quiet Sunday morning, everything changed. Mrs. Helen never came downstairs for breakfast. The woman who had opened her door to a frightened teenage mother, the woman who had saved 2 lives with a single act of kindness, had peacefully passed away in her sleep. I stood beside her bedroom door, unable to move, because losing the woman who gave me a future felt like losing my home all over again. The funeral was small, just the way Mrs. Helen would have wanted. There were no expensive flower arrangements, no dramatic speeches, only a handful of people whose lives she had quietly changed. Mr. Alvarez from the bakery stood beside me. 2 retired teachers came holding white roses. Several former students shared stories about the woman who never gave up on them. Lily spoke last. Her voice shook as she looked toward the simple wooden casket. She wasn't my grandmother by blood, but she loved me like one. There isn't a single day of my life that doesn't exist because of her kindness. There wasn't a dry eye in the cemetery. When the service ended, Lily slipped her hand into mine. We walked away together. Neither of us looked back. Mrs. Helen had already given us everything we needed. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was preparing for trial. The caller ID displayed a name I hadn't seen in years. David Sterling, Mrs. Helen's estate attorney. "Emma," he said gently, "there's something your mother never told you. I think you should come to my office." His tone wasn't emotional. It was serious, almost urgent. The next afternoon, Lily and I drove downtown. Mr. Sterling's office overlooked the city skyline. He greeted us warmly before placing a thick leather folder on his desk. "I've handled Mrs. Helen's legal affairs for nearly 25 years. He adjusted his glasses. "And she left very specific instructions." He slid a document across the desk. I expected paperwork transferring ownership of the house. Instead, I saw numbers that made my heart stop. Mrs. Helen hadn't only left us her home. She had created a trust worth nearly $750,000. I stared at the papers. "There has to be a mistake." Mr. Sterling smiled. "There isn't. For 20 years, she invested every extra dollar she had. She always said this money belonged to the 2 people who gave her life purpose." He looked at Lily. "And that was you." Neither of us could speak. For the next 48 hours, life felt strangely peaceful. We talked about repairing the old house, helping Lily finish medical school without debt, creating scholarships for homeless teenage mothers, exactly the kind of dream Mrs. Helen would have loved. Then, everything changed. Monday morning, my assistant knocked on my office door. "Emma, you've been served." She handed me a thick envelope. I frowned. "Served." I opened it. My stomach tightened. Someone was filing a civil lawsuit against me. The plaintiffs' names were printed across the first page. My mother, my stepfather, and my younger half-brother. I hadn't spoken to any of them in 20 years. Yet somehow, they were demanding Mrs. Helen's entire estate. According to the lawsuit, They claimed I had manipulated an elderly woman into rewriting her will. They even accused me of using my position as a prosecutor to intimidate witnesses. Every allegation was completely false. I leaned back in my chair and read every page carefully. Not once did I feel afraid. I felt disappointed. After 20 years, they still believed they could bully me. They still thought I was the frightened 16-year-old girl they had thrown into the rain with a newborn baby. They had no idea who I had become. That evening, my phone rang again. This time, it was my mother. For 20 years, she had never called to ask if I was alive. Never asked about Lily. Never apologized. Now, the first words out of her mouth were, "Emma, if you settle now, this doesn't have to become ugly." I closed my eyes, took one slow breath, then answered calmly, "It already became ugly. The night you abandoned your daughter." Without waiting for her reply, I ended the call, and for the first time since Mrs. Helen's funeral, I opened a fresh legal notebook. Across the top of the first page, I wrote 6 words: "See you in court." For the next 3 weeks, my office became my second home. Every morning, I arrived before sunrise. Every night, I was the last person to leave. The lawsuit my family had filed wasn't just insulting. It was carefully planned. Their attorney claimed Mrs. Helen had been mentally vulnerable. He argued that I had abused my position as a prosecutor to influence her decisions. They wanted the court to freeze every dollar of the trust. And if they won, Lily would lose the future Mrs. Helen had spent 20 years protecting. That wasn't going to happen. Not while I was breathing. Mr. Sterling and I spent countless hours reviewing every document Mrs. Helen had left behind. She had anticipated everything. Every amendment to her trust had been notarized. Every investment was documented. Every bank statement was preserved. She even kept handwritten journals explaining why she wanted Lily and me to inherit everything. As I flipped through those pages, one sentence caught my attention. "The people who stayed deserve what I built, not the people who disappeared when it mattered most." I smiled through the tears. Even after her death, Ms. Helen was still protecting us. One evening, while reviewing the case file, I noticed something strange. My family's attorney was rushing the hearing. He wanted an emergency ruling. Why? People don't rush unless they're desperate. The question stayed in my mind all night. The next morning, I called an old friend from the Financial Crimes Unit. His name was Daniel Ross. We had worked together on several fraud cases over the years. "I need a favor," I said. "Completely legal." He laughed. "When you call me, it's never a small favor." I handed him my stepfather's company name, my half-brother's business records, and the names of 2 corporations listed in the lawsuit. "Find out why they're in such a hurry." 3 days later, Daniel walked into my office carrying a thick folder. He closed the door, dropped the file onto my desk, and sighed. "You were right. They're desperate." Inside were public financial records, loan defaults, tax liens, court filings. My stepfather's construction company was drowning in debt. The business had lost several major contracts. Creditors were preparing to seize company assets. But that wasn't the worst part. My half-brother had secretly borrowed hundreds of thousands of dollars to launch a luxury real estate business. It had completely failed. Within 60 days, he was facing personal bankruptcy. Suddenly, everything made sense. This lawsuit had never been about honoring Mrs. Helen. It wasn't about justice. It wasn't even about family. They wanted her money because they needed someone else to pay for their own failures. And they believed I was still weak enough to let them. They were wrong. The morning of the hearing finally arrived. The courthouse looked exactly as it always did. Tall marble columns, wide stone steps, people rushing in every direction. Only this time, I wasn't walking in as a frightened teenager searching for help. I was walking in as the prosecutor they never imagined I could become. Lily walked beside me. She adjusted her navy blue blazer and smiled. "You ready, Mom?" I looked at the courthouse doors, then back at my daughter. "I've been ready for 20 years. Together, we climbed the courthouse steps. Neither of us knew it yet. But within the next hour, one simple sentence would change everything. Good morning, Prosecutor. The courthouse hallway was unusually quiet. The sound of polished shoes echoed across the marble floor as lawyers, clerks, and deputies hurried toward their courtrooms. I adjusted the sleeve of my navy blue suit and took one slow breath. Lily walked beside me, carrying a folder filled with copies of Mrs. Helen's journals and trust documents. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. Everything that mattered would happen inside that courtroom. As we turned the corner, I saw them. My mother, my stepfather, and my half-brother. 20 years had changed all of us. My mother's hair had turned silver around the edges. My stepfather's shoulders were lower than I remembered. My half-brother looked exhausted. Dark circles surrounded his eyes, and he kept nervously checking his phone every few seconds. Financial pressure had done what time couldn't. It had stolen his confidence. They hadn't noticed me yet. Their expensive attorney was standing with them, confidently reviewing notes and explaining what would happen inside the courtroom. He sounded completely in control. "Once the judge freezes the trust," he said, "we'll force a settlement. There won't be much she can do." My stepfather smiled. "I told you she'd never beat us." I took a few more steps. The lawyer looked up. At first, he didn't react. Then his eyes met mine. His confident smile disappeared. He blinked twice. As if he couldn't believe what he was seeing, I recognized him immediately. Michael Harper. 3 years earlier, he had defended the CEO of a multi-million-dollar fraud case I prosecuted. It had been one of the longest trials of my career. After 6 weeks of testimony, the jury returned guilty verdicts on every major charge. Harper had never forgotten that courtroom, and neither had I. His face slowly turned pale. The folder slipped slightly from his hand. For several seconds, neither of us said a word. Finally, he straightened his tie, forced a nervous smile, and quietly said, "Good morning, Prosecutor." The hallway went completely silent. My mother frowned. She looked at him in confusion. "Prosecutor?" My stepfather laughed. "What are you talking about?" Harper never took his eyes off me. His voice was calm, but I could hear the tension underneath. "You didn't tell me. Emma Carter is a senior prosecutor." The smile vanished from my stepfather's face. "What?" Harper slowly turned toward him. "You hired me to sue one of the most respected prosecutors in this courthouse." No one spoke. Even my half-brother stopped looking at his phone. He stared at me as though he were seeing me for the first time. My mother finally found her voice. "No, that can't be true." I looked directly at her. "It is. You stopped believing in me 20 years ago. I never stopped believing in myself." She lowered her eyes. For the first time, she had no answer. Just then, the courtroom doors opened. The bailiff stepped into the hallway. "The estate of Helen Brooks. Counsel, please come inside." Harper closed his briefcase. His confidence was gone. As he walked past me, he leaned closer and whispered, "I wish they'd told me who you were before I accepted this case." I looked at him without anger, then calmly replied, "They had 20 years to know who I became. They never cared enough to find out." He lowered his head and quietly walked into the courtroom. I watched my family follow him. For the first time in my life, they weren't walking ahead of me. They were walking into a battle they had already lost. The courtroom was silent. Judge Rebecca Lawson adjusted her glasses and looked toward the plaintiff's table. "Counsel," she said, "you may begin." Attorney Michael Harper stood and walked confidently to the podium. At least, he tried to look confident. His voice was steady, but I could hear the hesitation that hadn't been there in the hallway. "Your Honor," he began, "this case concerns undue influence over a vulnerable elderly woman. We believe Ms. Carter used her position and personal relationship with Mrs. Helen Brooks to persuade her into leaving behind an unfair estate plan." He paused before continuing. "We respectfully request that the trust be frozen until this matter can be fully investigated." He returned to his seat. The courtroom became quiet once again. Judge Lawson turned toward our table. "Mr. Sterling." My attorney stood. "Your Honor, the defense is prepared to demonstrate that every allegation made by the plaintiffs is completely unsupported by evidence." He looked at me. "With the court's permission, my co-counsel would like to present the evidence." The judge nodded. "You may proceed." I slowly stood, picked up a thick black binder, and walked to the podium. Every pair of eyes followed me, not because I was nervous, because they were waiting to see what would happen next. I opened the binder. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs claim Mrs. Helen Brooks was manipulated. I intend to prove exactly the opposite." I placed the first document on the evidence screen. Exhibit A, Mrs. Helen's medical evaluations. Every annual examination confirmed the same conclusion: mentally competent, fully capable of making independent legal decisions. I placed another file beside it. Exhibit B, 20 years of bank statements, investment records, tax documents. Every dollar inside the trust had been earned, invested, and documented by Mrs. Helen herself. No outside influence, no hidden transfers, no suspicious activity, only patience, discipline, and 20 years of planning. The judge quietly reviewed every page, then looked toward the plaintiffs. Their confidence had already begun to disappear. I wasn't finished. "Your Honor, I'd now like to submit Exhibit C." Mr. Sterling handed me a sealed envelope. I carefully removed a handwritten letter. The date was exactly 20 years old. Mrs. Helen had written it the night she welcomed Lily and me into her home. I looked toward the judge. "With the court's permission, I'd like to read one paragraph." "You may." I unfolded the letter. My voice remained calm. "If anyone ever questions why Emma and Lily inherit everything I own, let this letter answer them. Family isn't the people who share your blood. Family is the people who stay when everyone else walks away. The night Emma arrived at my door with a newborn baby, she wasn't looking for money. She was looking for hope. I promised myself that night that whatever I built would belong to the young woman who never gave up, and to the little girl who gave her a reason to keep fighting." When I finished reading, the courtroom was completely silent. Even Attorney Harper lowered his eyes. I slowly closed the letter, then looked directly toward my mother. "There's one final question this court deserves answered." I turned toward the judge. "Why now? Why wait 20 years? I pressed a button on the courtroom monitor. A financial report appeared on the large screen. Public records, business filings, outstanding loans, tax liens. Everything had been obtained legally. These records show that the plaintiff's business is facing foreclosure. I changed the slide. Another report appeared. My half-brother owes hundreds of thousands of dollars in personal debt. Another click. Their lawsuit was filed less than 2 weeks after default notices were issued. I looked back at the judge. This case was never about Mrs. Helen. It was never about justice. It was about money. They didn't come here to honor the woman who raised my daughter. They came here hoping to use this court to rescue themselves from financial ruin. The silence felt heavier than ever. Judge Lawson slowly removed her glasses. She studied every document one last time. Then she looked toward the plaintiffs. "Does the plaintiff wish to dispute any of this evidence?" No one answered. My stepfather stared at the table. My mother quietly wiped away tears. My half-brother couldn't even look at the judge. Attorney Harper slowly stood. He took a deep breath, then quietly said, "No, Your Honor." Judge Lawson nodded once. "The court has heard enough." She reached for her gavel, and in that single moment, I knew the storm that had followed me for 20 years was finally about to end. Judge Rebecca Lawson looked across the courtroom one final time. She folded her hands, then reached for the wooden gavel. The room was so quiet. I could hear someone breathing in the back row. Bang! The sound echoed through the courtroom. This court finds that the plaintiffs have presented no credible evidence of undue influence, fraud, or misconduct. She paused. The trust established by Mrs. Helen Brooks is legally valid and shall remain exactly as written. A wave of relief washed over me, but the judge wasn't finished. She turned toward my mother and stepfather. "This lawsuit was filed without sufficient legal merit and appears to have been motivated by financial desperation rather than justice." Her voice became firmer. "Accordingly, the plaintiffs are ordered to pay all court costs and the reasonable attorney's fees incurred by the defense." My mother closed her eyes. My stepfather's shoulders slumped. My half-brother buried his face in his hands. Everything they had planned had collapsed in a matter of minutes. The judge struck the gavel one last time. "This case is dismissed. Court is adjourned." People slowly stood. Conversations filled the courtroom. Attorneys gathered their files. Reporters waiting outside hurried toward the hallway. Mr. Sterling shook my hand. "I've practiced law for 38 years. I've never seen a stronger defense." I smiled. "I learned from the best." He knew exactly who I meant. Lily walked over and wrapped her arms around me. "We did it, Mom." I hugged her tightly. "No." We honored her. For a moment, neither of us said another word. We didn't need to. Mrs. Helen's kindness had won one final time. As we stepped into the courthouse hallway, a familiar voice called my name. "Emma." I turned around. It was my mother. She looked nothing like the woman who had thrown me out 20 years earlier. Her confidence was gone. Her eyes were red from crying. She slowly walked toward me. "I made the biggest mistake of my life." Her voice trembled. "I was afraid of what people would think. I chose my reputation instead of my daughter." Tears rolled down her face. "I'm sorry." The apology I'd imagined hearing for 20 years had finally come, but something inside me had changed long ago. I didn't hate her anymore. I simply wasn't waiting for her love. I looked at her quietly. Then I answered, "I forgave you years ago, but forgiveness doesn't erase consequences." She lowered her head. "I know." I nodded once. "You lost your daughter the night you closed your front door. And today, I'm simply closing mine." There was no anger in my voice, only peace. I took Lily's hand, and together, we walked away. This time, no one followed. That evening, we returned to Mrs. Helen's house. The little white home looked exactly the way it always had. The garden she loved was blooming. The porch swing moved gently in the summer breeze. Inside, everything still carried her warmth. The bookshelf, the old wooden table, the faded blue cardigan hanging behind the kitchen door. Lily quietly placed a framed photograph of Mrs. Helen on the mantel. Beside it, she placed a handwritten sign, the Helen Brooks Hope Foundation. Using part of the trust, we created scholarships for homeless teenage mothers determined to finish school. We also helped young women find safe housing, childcare, and legal assistance. Exactly the kind of future Mrs. Helen had dreamed about. Years later, I often visited the foundation without telling anyone who I was. Sometimes, I'd see a frightened 16-year-old mother walk through the front door carrying her baby. She always had the same expression I once had: fear, exhaustion, uncertainty. And every single time, I'd walk over, smile, open the door a little wider, and say the same 7 words that had once saved my life. Come inside, sweetheart. You're safe now. Because I finally understood something Mrs. Helen had taught me without ever saying it aloud. A single act of kindness can echo across generations. The people who abandoned me gave me my deepest wounds. But the woman who believed in me gave hundreds of families a future. And that was the greatest victory of all.